King and the Infinite Library. King Eldric III had ruled the kingdom of Valmir for 27 years when he first heard whispers of the Infinite Library. The rumors came from a merchant who travelled from lands beyond the eastern mountains, speaking of a place where every book ever written, and every book that could ever be written, existed in endless corridors of knowledge. The merchant claimed it appeared only to those who sought answers they could find nowhere else. Aldrich had everything a king could want: a prosperous realm, loyal subjects, 3 healthy children, and a wife who still made him laugh after 31 years of marriage. Yet something gnawed at him during sleepless nights in his 54th year of life. He'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and lately he'd begun to wonder, had he made the right choices? The execution he'd ordered in the year 1473, the treaty he'd refused in 1480, the war he'd waged when he was only 29 years old. "You can't undo the past, my love," Queen Isidora told him one evening, as they walked through the palace gardens. The roses were blooming late that year, their red petals catching the golden light of the setting sun. "I know," Aldrich replied, pausing by the fountain where they'd first kissed 4 decades earlier. "But I wonder if I could at least understand it better. Understand whether another path might have led to less suffering." 3 nights later, unable to sleep, Aldrich rose from his bed and dressed in simple traveling clothes. He left a note for Isidora. She'd be furious, but she'd understand, and slipped out through a servant's passage he'd discovered as a boy of 12. The palace had been built in the year 1328, and its secret corridors had witnessed the comings and goings of 6 generations of monarchs. The merchant had said the library appeared in places of transition, where one thing ended and another began. Aldrich rode his horse to the border of his kingdom, where Valmir met the unclaimed wildlands. Dawn was still 2 hours away, and the darkness seemed absolute beneath the canopy of ancient oaks. He dismounted and walked forward, leading his horse by the reins. The boundary marker, a stone pillar erected 700 years ago, rose from the earth like a finger pointing at the stars. Aldrich had been here only once before, as a young prince of 17, testing his courage against the unknown. "I seek the Infinite Library," he said aloud, feeling foolish. "I have questions that need answering." The forest remained silent. Minutes passed. His horse nickeled nervously, ears swiveling toward sounds Aldrich couldn't hear. Then, gradually, he noticed something impossible. Light was emanating from between 2 particularly massive oak trees, though sunrise was still far off. The light was warm and golden, like candlelight multiplied by 10,000 flames. Aldrich tied his horse to a low branch and approached the light. As he stepped between the oaks, the forest disappeared. He stood instead in an entrance hall so vast that its ceiling vanished into shadow high above. Shelves stretched in every direction, each one filled with books of every size and color imaginable. The air smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and something else, something like possibility itself. "Welcome, King Aldrich III of Valmir," a voice said. Aldrich spun around to find a figure standing beside him. Or rather, what appeared to be a figure. It shifted constantly, sometimes appearing as a wizened old woman, sometimes as a young man, sometimes as something neither human nor quite anything else. "I am the keeper. You may ask the library one question." "Only one?" Aldrich's heart sank. He had so many questions. "The library is infinite," the keeper said, "but mortal minds are not. One question is all you can carry back with you. Choose wisely." Aldrich thought of all the decisions that haunted him. The rebellious lord he'd executed when he was 26. The famine during the harsh winter of 1468, when he'd had to choose which provinces received aid first. The daughter he'd betrothed to a foreign prince when she was only 15, securing peace but breaking her heart. "I want to know," he said slowly, "if I made the right choice when I executed Lord Brennan for treason in the year 1473. The keeper's form solidified into something almost human, an old librarian with spectacles perched on a long nose. "Follow me." They walked through corridors of books that seemed to reshape themselves as they passed. Aldrich glimpsed titles in languages he recognized, and dozens he didn't. Some books were massive tomes that would require 3 men to lift. Others were tiny volumes no larger than his thumb. Some glowed with inner light. Others seemed to absorb the illumination around them, leaving pools of shadow on their shelves. After what felt like both moments and hours, the keeper stopped before a shelf and pulled out a leather-bound volume of moderate size. The cover bore no title, only a date embossed in gold, 1473. "This book contains the story of what happened," the keeper said, "and what would have happened had you chosen differently." Aldrich opened the book with trembling hands. The pages were crisp and clean, the text written in elegant script that seemed to rearrange itself into his native language as he looked at it. He began to read. Lord Brennan had indeed plotted against him. That much was true. The evidence Aldrich's spy master had presented was genuine. Letters discussing the overthrow of the crown, meetings with foreign agents, plans to assassinate the king during the Festival of Harvests. Aldrich had agonized over the decision for 3 sleepless nights before ordering Brennan's execution. The man had been his childhood friend, someone who'd fought beside him in the Northern Wars, someone whose children played with his own. The book showed him what he'd known and what he hadn't. Brennan's eldest son, Thomas, had watched his father die on the executioner's block. The boy had been 14. The book showed Thomas growing up with rage carved into his heart like words into stone. At 21, Thomas led a small rebellion that killed 47 soldiers before being crushed. At 23, he was captured and executed, just as his father had been. But there was more. Brennan's younger children were absorbed into other noble families, raised with the stain of their father's treason marking them forever. His daughter, Catherine, became a skilled healer, saving countless lives during the plague of 1491. But she never married, never allowed herself happiness, carrying guilt for a crime she hadn't committed. Aldrich's hands shook as he turned the pages. Then he reached the section titled "The Alternate." In this version, Aldrich had exiled Lord Brennan instead of executing him. The traitor was sent across the Eastern Sea with enough gold to live modestly, but forbidden from ever returning to Valmere. Thomas grew up bitter, but not consumed by vengeance. He became a merchant in the distant city of Calspar, married a weaver's daughter, had 4 children. Catherine married a carpenter and lived a quiet, happy life, her healing skills unknown to history. But the alternate history showed other changes too. Without Brennan's execution as an example, 3 other lords grew bolder in their treasonous ambitions. A coup attempt came in 1479, resulting in a civil war that killed thousands. The kingdom was fractured for 7 years. Famine spread as farms were burned and trade routes destroyed. Aldric's own son Edmund was killed in battle at age 19. The version where Aldric showed mercy to one man led to catastrophe for many. The version where he ordered an execution, despite the personal pain, despite losing a friend, maintained peace and stability for decades. But Thomas, Aldric whispered, that boy made his own choices, the keeper said gently. His pain was real, shaped by your decision. But pain exists in all timelines, Your Majesty. The question isn't whether suffering exists. It always does. The question is whether the choices you made minimized unnecessary harm while upholding necessary principles. Aldric closed the book, and immediately its contents began to fade from his mind like morning mist, leaving only impressions and feelings. He could no longer recall the specific details, but he remembered the essence. His decision had been terrible and tragic, and also necessary. There had been no good choice, only the least destructive one. This is what you came to learn? The keeper asked. I don't know, Aldric admitted. His chest felt both heavier and lighter somehow. I thought I wanted certainty. I wanted to know I'd done the right thing. But there was no right thing, was there? Just the choice I made with the information I had, trying my best. Kings rarely have the luxury of good options, the keeper agreed. Only consequential ones. They walked back through the corridors of infinite books. Aldric glimpsed countless other volumes he longed to read. Books about his other decisions, surely, but also books about everything else imaginable. Aldric paused before a shelf where a slim volume caught his eye. The cover was deep blue, like the ocean on a clear day, and it bore a title in silver letters. The King Who Read Too Much. He reached for it, but the keeper's hand, suddenly solid and surprisingly strong, caught his wrist. Your question has been answered, the keeper said. Each visitor is permitted only one question. To read more would be to exceed the capacity of your mortal mind to hold knowledge without being destroyed by it. But there's so much I want to know, Aldric protested, even as he lowered his hand. The treaty with Castor refused in 1480. Was that the right choice? The religious reforms I implemented when I was 33, the tax on grain I levied during... Stop, the keeper interrupted, and though the voice wasn't loud, it carried the weight of avalanches and tidal waves. Do you truly want to know all of this? To see every path not taken, every consequence of every choice, to carry the weight of infinite might-have-beens? Aldric opened his mouth to say yes, then slowly closed it. He thought about the book he'd just read, how even now its specific details were fading, leaving only impressions. The human mind wasn't built to hold perfect knowledge of even one decision's full ramifications, let alone dozens or hundreds. There was a king once, the keeper said, and they resumed walking toward the entrance hall. He came to this library 500 years ago. He asked his question and received his answer, just as you did. But as he was leaving, he grew convinced he needed more knowledge. He broke free from my guidance and ran into the stacks, pulling down volume after volume, reading frantically. What happened to him? He's still here, the keeper said. Read it. He's been reading for 5 centuries, and he will read for 5 more, and 5 after that, forever. He knows everything now. every possible outcome of every possible choice made by every possible person. The weight of that knowledge has crushed his mind into something that can no longer be called human. He understands everything and nothing. He exists in all timelines and none. They reached the entrance hall, where moonlight from the outside world created a rectangle of silver light between the oak trees. Aldrich's horse waited patiently beyond. "Before you go," the keeper said, "I offer you something freely, not in answer to your question, a truth that every visitor to the Infinite Library must eventually understand." Aldrich turned to face the shifting figure. "What truth?" "That certainty is a cage," the keeper said. "You came here seeking to know if you'd made the right choice, but right and wrong are not absolutes in the way mortals hope they are. You are a king, which means you make choices that affect thousands of lives. Some of those people will suffer because of your decisions. Others will thrive. Some would have suffered more under different decisions. Others would have thrived more. There is no timeline where everyone is happy. No choice that leads to universal good." "Then how am I supposed to rule?" Aldrich asked, feeling suddenly very young despite his 54 years. "How do I make these impossible choices?" "The way you've been doing," the keeper replied, "with the information available to you, with careful thought, with advisors you trust, with principles you hold dear, and then, having made your choice, you live with it. You accept that you are fallible, that you cannot know everything, that you will sometimes be wrong, and you continue forward, doing your best." "That doesn't feel like enough," Aldrich said quietly. "It never does," the keeper agreed, "but it's all any mortal can do. Even kings, especially kings." Aldrich looked back into the vast library one last time. Somewhere in those infinite corridors was a book about every moment of his life, every decision he would ever make, every possible version of himself that might exist in other timelines. The temptation to stay, to read, to know everything was almost overwhelming. "The king who stayed," Aldrich said. "The one who's been reading for 500 years. What was his name?" "He doesn't remember anymore," the keeper said sadly. "That's part of what was lost." Aldrich walked toward the moonlight. As he stepped between the oak trees, the library vanished behind him as if it had never existed. His horse greeted him with a soft whinny. The forest was alive with the sounds of early morning. Birds beginning their dawn chorus, small creatures rustling in the undergrowth, wind whispering through leaves. He rode home slowly, arriving at the palace just as the sun breached the eastern horizon. The guards at the gate startled to see their king returning alone, dressed in traveling clothes, but they knew better than to question him. Word spread quickly through the palace, and by the time Aldrich reached his chambers, Isidora was waiting for him, her face a mixture of relief and fury. "You could have been killed," she said, embracing him tightly despite her anger, riding out alone in the middle of the night like a foolish boy of 16 instead of a king of 54 years. "I had to," Aldrich said simply, holding her close. "I had questions that needed answering." "And did you find your answers?" Aldrich thought about the book he'd read, its details already almost completely faded from his memory. He could no longer recall the specific events it had described, but he remembered the feeling, that terrible, necessary weight of leadership. He remembered understanding that there had been no good choice, only the choice he'd made. Yes, he said. And no, I learned that I'll never really know if I've made the right choices. I can only make the best choices I can with what I know at the time. Isadora pulled back to look at him, studying his face. You traveled somewhere strange to learn something you already knew. I knew it, Aldrich admitted, but I didn't believe it. Not really. I kept thinking there must be a way to know for certain, to have proof that I'd done the right thing. And now? Now I understand that certainty is impossible, and that's terrifying, but also somehow freeing. Over the following weeks, Aldrich found himself making decisions differently. Not radically so. He still consulted his advisors, still weighed options carefully, still agonized over difficult choices. But when he finally made a decision, he accepted it rather than torturing himself with endless second-guessing. He'd done his best with the information available. That had to be enough. When a dispute arose between two noble families over land rights, he made his judgment and moved forward, accepting that one family would be unhappy, rather than trying to find a perfect solution that would satisfy everyone. When the harvest fell short, and he had to decide how to distribute grain from the royal stores, he made his choice knowing that some would suffer more than others, but that delay would make everyone suffer more. He was more present with his children, less consumed by regret over past decisions. He laughed more with Isadora. He slept better at night. Years passed. Aldrich grew older, his hair turning from grey to white, his joints stiffening, his memory becoming unreliable in small ways. He never spoke of the infinite library to anyone except Isadora, and even with her, he said little. What was there to say? That he'd found a magical place and learned he was fallible? She'd always known that. When Aldrich was 71 years old and lying in bed with a fever his physicians couldn't cure, Isadora sat beside him, holding his hand. Their eldest son, Edmund, named for Aldrich's father, would be crowned king within days or weeks. The kingdom was prosperous and at peace. Not perfect, never perfect, but stable and hopeful. Do you have regrets? Isadora asked him softly. Aldrich thought about his life, his reign, his choices. Of course, he had regrets. Lord Brennan's execution still haunted him on dark nights, though he'd long since made peace with the necessity of it. He regretted the harshness of some of his early judgments when he'd been young and trying to prove his strength. He regretted missing his daughter's 12th birthday because of a diplomatic crisis he now couldn't even remember. Many, he said honestly, but I also know I made the best choices I could at the time. I can't ask more of myself than that. You were a good king, Isadora said, tears streaming down her face. A good man. I tried to be, Aldrich replied. That's all any of us can do. Try our best and accept our limits. He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, having ruled Valmere for 44 years. The kingdom mourned him, and historians would later call his reign the Golden Peace, a time of stability between eras of strife. But Aldrich would have laughed at that title. He knew the truth, that there had been plenty of strife during his reign, plenty of hard choices and impossible decisions, and people who suffered because of things he did or failed to do. But he'd also learned in an infinite library on the border between his kingdom and the wildlands that perfect knowledge was a curse and certainty was an illusion. He'd learned to make peace with his own fallibility, to accept that leadership meant carrying the weight of consequential choices without ever being certain they were right. And somehow, paradoxically, that acceptance had made him a better king than the desperate quest for certainty ever could have. In the Infinite Library, a new book appeared on a shelf in a distant corridor. Its cover was simple leather, its title embossed in gold: King Aldric III of Valmere. Inside its pages were all the choices he'd made, all the timelines he'd created, all the lives he'd touched for better and worse. The keeper, in one of its infinite forms, shelved the book carefully among countless others, the stories of kings and peasants, heroes and villains, all the souls who'd ever lived or would ever live. And in a clearing between two ancient oaks, where a stone marker had stood for over 700 years, the boundary between kingdoms remained unchanged. Occasionally, a traveler would pause there and sense something, a whisper of possibility, a hint of light that shouldn't exist, a feeling that if they spoke their deepest question aloud, someone might answer. But most people simply passed through without noticing, continuing their journeys, making their choices, living their lives without certainty but with hope, which had always been enough. The forgotten phantom king of Angkor. The jungle had swallowed the truth whole, and for 700 years, nobody thought to ask what it was choking on. You stand in the archives of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient in Siem Reap, holding a palm leaf manuscript that shouldn't exist. The edges crumble at your touch, releasing the smell of centuries, earth and incense and something else, something like burned sugar. The script is Old Khmer, the kind used in the 12th century, but the carbon dating says 1300, a gap of 100 years, an impossible gap. The manuscript mentions a name that appears nowhere else in the historical record: Tribhuvanad Dyavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, a phantom. The official histories of Angkor are precise, almost obsessively so. They tell you that after the death of King Jayavarman VII in approximately 1220, the empire entered a period of decline. They tell you about his successors: Indravarman II, Jayavarman VIII, the gradual conversion to Theravada Buddhism, the slow fade of Angkorian glory. They tell you everything except this, that between 1221 and 1223, someone ruled who was systematically erased from every stone inscription, every royal chronicle, every temple wall. Someone the jungle remembers, even if history doesn't. The first clue came from the trees. A French botanist named Claudine Mercier was studying the growth rings of dipterocarp trees in the Angkor Archaeological Park when she noticed something odd. Several ancient specimens showed a pattern of accelerated growth during a 2-year period in the early 13th century, followed by sudden stress markers. Trees don't lie about climate. Something had changed in those years. A shift in water management, perhaps, or a dramatic alteration in the forest canopy. The irrigation systems told a similar story. Ground-penetrating radar revealed modifications to the Beret reservoirs that didn't match any known construction phase. Someone had re-engineered the hydraulic network of Angkor with extraordinary sophistication, then abandoned the work halfway through. The modifications used techniques that wouldn't appear in Khmer engineering for another 50 years. You trace the phantom through absence, through the spaces between documented reigns, through the archaeological shadows. The Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan visited Angkor in 1296 and described the customs of the Khmer court in meticulous detail, But he also mentioned something curious. The monks he spoke with referred to a period they called the Silent Years, a time when the temples fell quiet and the royal ceremonies ceased. They wouldn't explain further. Some silences, they said, were mandatory. The stone inscriptions are where the erasure becomes visible. At Ta Prohm, you find a dedication stele from 1222 that's been partially recarved. The original text is still legible beneath the new layer if you know how to look. It speaks of a king who brought the waters to speak and made the stones remember their purpose. But then, chisel marks. Someone had taken great care to obliterate specific passages while leaving the rest intact. You take rubbings, photograph the angles of light across the damaged surfaces, and slowly, impossibly, a name emerges from the stone's memory. Tribhuvanadityavarman, the Sun King of 3 worlds. His reign left physical marks that couldn't be completely erased. At Preah Khan, hidden behind a later edition, you discover a small shrine with astronomical alignments that match no other structure in Angkor. The calculations are breathtaking in their precision. Someone had understood the precession of the equinoxes, had mapped the stars with mathematical accuracy that rivaled anything being done in Song Dynasty China. The shrine was built to capture sunlight on one specific day of the year, the 3rd of February, 1222. You check the Chinese astronomical records. On that date, a total solar eclipse passed directly over Angkor. The path of totality would have turned day to night for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. A Sun King who brought darkness at noon. The symbolism is almost too perfect. The Vietnamese annals provide an unexpected fragment. In 1222, they recorded a diplomatic mission to Angkor that returned in confusion. The embassy had been received by a king who wasn't the expected successor to Jayavarman VII. This king spoke in riddles, they reported, and had covered the palace mirrors with silk. He asked the Vietnamese envoys whether a reflection could rule a kingdom, and whether shadows had more substance than the things that cast them. The envoys concluded he was mad and terminated negotiations. But perhaps he wasn't mad. Perhaps he was asking a more profound question about the nature of power and legitimacy. You find his face in the least likely place, a minor temple called Krol Ko, dedicated to Jayavarman VII's royal guru. Tucked into a decorative panel, almost invisible unless you're looking for it, is a portrait carving unlike any other at Angkor. The style is wrong for the period, too naturalistic, too psychologically penetrating. The face belongs to a young man, perhaps 30 years old, with eyes that seem to look through stone rather than at the viewer, and there, in the tiny inscription beneath, the name again, Tribhuvanadityavarman. The few fragments of his story that survive suggest someone extraordinary. He appeared at court in 1220, claiming to be the son of Jayavarman VII by a concubine who had lived in the temple of Preah Khan. No one could verify the claim, but no one could disprove it either. He demonstrated knowledge of royal ritual that only someone raised in the palace could possess. He spoke 5 languages fluently, including Chinese and Cham. He could recite the entire Ramayana from memory, and he had ideas about how to save the empire. By 1220, Angkor was already in trouble, though the official inscriptions maintained the fiction of eternal glory. The hydraulic system that had sustained the city for 400 years was failing. Deforestation had destabilized the watersheds. The barais were silting up. The climate was shifting toward drought. The empire needed innovation, needed someone willing to break with tradition. Tribhuvanaditya Varman proposed a radical restructuring of the water management system, based on principles he claimed to have learned from treatises brought from India. He wanted to implement a network of smaller, distributed reservoirs rather than relying on the massive royal berets. He wanted to introduce new rice cultivation techniques, new crops, new patterns of settlement. He wanted to reform the corvée labor system that was bleeding the countryside dry. The conservative faction at court was horrified. These proposals threatened the entire cosmological order that Angkorian kingship represented. The berets weren't just irrigation systems. They were replicas of the cosmic ocean. The temples weren't just monuments. They were the axis mundi, connecting earth to heaven. You couldn't simply reorganize them for efficiency. But Jayavarman VII was dying, and in his final months, he made a decision that would haunt the empire. He named Tribhuvanaditya Varman as regent, giving him authority to implement his reforms on a trial basis. For 2 years, the Phantom King would have the chance to prove his vision. The archaeological record of those 2 years is thin but tantalizing. Construction began on 17 new reservoirs in a ring around Angkor. New canal systems were dug following principles of gradient and flow that were genuinely innovative. Agricultural experimental stations appeared in the countryside, testing drought-resistant crop varieties. The labourers conscripted for these projects were treated differently, paid in rice and cloth, rather than simply compelled, housed in better conditions, given days of rest. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. The rice harvests of 1221 were the best in a generation. The new reservoirs held water through the dry season. The experimental crops proved viable. Tribhuvanaditya Varman's reforms were succeeding, and that was precisely the problem. The Brahmin priests, who legitimized royal power through their mastery of Sanskrit ritual, found themselves sidelined. The great families who controlled the temple estates saw their influence waning. The generals who had built careers on conquest watched resources redirected to irrigation and agriculture. The Phantom King had accumulated too many enemies too quickly, and he had failed to understand the most important rule of Angkorian politics. Power wasn't about effectiveness, it was about performance. When Jayavarman VII finally died in late 1221, the conservative faction moved quickly. They installed Indravarman II, a royal cousin who represented continuity and tradition. Tribhuvanaditya Varman refused to cede power. He claimed that Jayavarman had recognized him as a true son in a deathbed declaration. He argued that his reforms were succeeding and deserved more time. He made the fatal mistake of believing that results mattered more than legitimacy. The civil war that followed lasted less than 6 months, but it was vicious enough to scar the empire permanently. Tribhuvanaditya Varman held Angkor Thom itself, along with several major temples. Indravarman controlled the countryside and the loyalty of most provincial governors. The conflict wasn't fought with massive armies. The empire was already too depleted for that. Instead, it was a war of sieges and skirmishes, of water supplies cut off and food stores blockaded, of temples fortified and populations starved. In May of 1222, during the eclipse he'd calculated so precisely, Tribhuvanaditya Varman attempted a final gambit. He staged an elaborate ceremony at the Bayon, claiming that the darkened sun proved his divine mandate. If the gods had not favoured him, he proclaimed, they would not have written his legitimacy across the sky. For 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the world turned dark in the middle of the day. In that darkness, he declared himself sole legitimate king. It was a magnificent piece of theatre, but it changed nothing. Indravarman's forces breached Angkor Thom's defences 2 weeks later, and Tribhuvanadityavarman vanished into the jungle with a handful of loyal followers. What happened next is the strangest part of the story. Most failed pretenders to the Khmer throne were executed publicly, their deaths inscribed on temple walls as warnings, but there's no record of Tribhuvanadityavarman's death, no triumphant inscription celebrating his defeat, no description of his punishment. Instead, there's a systematic erasure that required time, effort, and coordination. Every inscription bearing his name was recarved. Every temple dedication was modified. Every official document was destroyed or amended. The new reservoirs he had built were attributed to earlier kings or left anonymous. His reforms were quietly maintained. They worked too well to abandon, but credit for them vanished into the administrative record. It was as if the empire had decided that the Phantom King was more dangerous as a martyr than as a forgotten footnote. By erasing him completely, they denied him even the dignity of defeat. But erasure is never complete. The jungle keeps its own records. In 1223, a small temple was constructed deep in the forest, far from Angkor's administrative center. It's called Bantai Chmar, though that's not its original name. The structure is modest by Angkorian standards, but the inscriptions are peculiar. They speak of a king who walked among the stones like a shadow, and whose name was Silence. They describe someone who had rejected worldly power to seek a different kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty of understanding, of seeing the empire's problems with clarity, even if he couldn't solve them. Some scholars think Tribhuvanadityavarman lived out his days at this temple, protected by monks who still believed in his vision. Others suggest he died in the jungle during the rainy season of 1223, just another casualty of the Civil War's aftermath. The Vietnamese annals mention rumors of a Khmer prince living in exile in Champa, teaching astronomy and hydraulic engineering, but they never name him. You prefer to think he survived, at least for a while. The evidence is circumstantial, a pattern of temple construction in remote areas over the next decade that uses his innovative techniques, a series of inscriptions that seem to quote his ideas without attribution, the spread of his agricultural reforms despite official silence about their origin. It's as if his vision outlived his political existence, propagating itself through the empire like seeds scattered on the wind. The supreme irony is that many of Tribhuvanadityavarman's reforms became standard practice within a generation. The distributed reservoir system he proposed was gradually implemented. The agricultural innovations were adopted. The labor practices were modified in the direction he had advocated. The empire absorbed his ideas even as it erased his name, like a body rejecting a transplanted organ while somehow integrating its function. By the time Zhou Deguan visited Angkor in 1296, the silent years had become a kind of parable. The monks told him that there had once been a king who tried to change too much too quickly, who had forgotten that empires move like trees rather than like water. Fast growth, they said, produces weak wood. The forest knows to grow slowly, to add each ring patiently, to respect the wisdom of gradual change. But you wonder if they were right. Standing in the ruins of Angkor now, with the jungle reclaiming the stones and the berets turned to swamps, you can't help but think that perhaps Tribhuvanadityavarman's great failure was also his greatest insight. He understood that the empire was dying, that the old cosmological certainties couldn't sustain a civilization facing climate change and resource depletion. He tried to adapt, to innovate, to imagine a different kind of Khmer greatness. And for that vision, he was erased. The palm leaf manuscript you're holding contains what might be his only surviving words, written in his own hand or copied by someone who knew him. The script is elegant, the reasoning clear. He writes about water as if it were a living teacher, about rice as if it contained the secrets of governance, about the relationship between rulers and ruled as a kind of mutual responsibility rather than cosmic hierarchy. It's radical stuff for the 13th century, ideas that wouldn't become common for another 500 years. On the final page, there's a statement that might be his epitaph. A king who cannot be forgotten has failed, for he has made himself more important than his kingdom. Better to be the rain that falls in darkness, unnamed but necessary, than the sun that burns so bright it leaves only desert behind. The Phantom King of Angkor understood something that the official histories still haven't grasped. Greatness isn't always written in stone. Sometimes it's written in the patterns of water flowing through carefully engineered channels, in rice growing in drought-resistant varieties, in the small daily miracles of a system that works even after everyone's forgotten who designed it. You carefully return the manuscript to its climate-controlled case, aware that you're handling something that maybe a dozen people have read in 700 years. Outside, the sun is setting over the ruins of the Bayon, turning the stone faces gold and crimson. In this light, you can almost see him, a young man standing at the center of the world, calculating eclipses and water flow, trying to save an empire that didn't want to be saved. The jungle has swallowed most of the evidence, but here and there, if you know where to look, the Phantom King still haunts the stones. His reservoirs still hold water in the right season. His canal systems still follow the contours of the land with elegant efficiency. His ideas still whisper through the archives, anonymous but persistent. History remembers the kings who built the tallest temples, who conquered the most territory, who inscribed their names largest on the surviving stones. But the jungle remembers something else. It remembers the king who understood that water matters more than monuments, that systems outlast personalities, that the greatest power might be the power to disappear while leaving the world slightly better than you found it. Tribhuvanaditya Varman, the Sun King of 3 worlds, the Phantom King of Angkor, he ruled for 2 years and has been forgotten for 700. But his vision remains, encoded in the landscape like a message written in a language the stones are still learning to read. And perhaps that's the only kind of immortality worth having. Not to be remembered, but to have mattered. Not to echo through the ages, but to change them in ways too subtle for history to notice. The eclipse he calculated so carefully passed into darkness and returned to light, as all eclipses do. But the shadow it cast is still there, if you know how to see it, still there in the water flowing through channels he designed, in the rice growing in fields his reforms made possible, in the slow, patient work of trying to imagine a better world even when the world isn't ready to listen. That's the story the jungle tells in the language of roots and stone and water. The story of the king who was never there, whose reign was a dream the empire tried to forget, whose greatest achievement was to disappear so completely that his ideas could survive without him. The forgotten phantom king of Angkor, whose absence speaks louder than any inscription. The forgotten ice king of the north. In the far reaches of the world, where the auroras painted the sky in ribbons of emerald and violet, there existed a kingdom that time itself seemed reluctant to remember. The land stretched across frozen tundras and mountains of crystalline ice that caught the weak sunlight and scattered it into 1,000 dancing prisms. This was the domain of Iskeran the Pale, a ruler whose name had been whispered in awe and terror for generations, though now those whispers had faded into the howling winds that swept across his desolate realm. Iskeran had not always been forgotten. Once, his kingdom of Norvengard had been a jewel among the northern territories, a place where artisans crafted sculptures from ice that never melted, and where merchants travelled from distant lands to trade in furs so white they seemed spun from clouds. The capital city, Crystal Haven, had risen from the permafrost like a crown of frozen stars, its spires reaching toward the heavens as if in defiance of the harsh climate that sought to crush all life beneath its weight. In those days, Iskeran had been called the Just, the Wise, the Guardian of the Eternal Winter. His people had loved him, for he had brought prosperity to a land where survival itself was an achievement worthy of celebration. But that was before the curse, before the long silence, before the world turned its back on the Ice King and his frozen domain. Now, 3 centuries after his disappearance from the annals of history, Iskeran sat alone in his throne room, a vast chamber carved from a single glacier that had stood for millennia. The throne itself was a masterwork of nature and magic combined, formed from ice that blazed with an inner light, neither warm nor cold, but something in between, something that existed outside the normal laws of temperature and time. The Ice King's appearance reflected the centuries of isolation that had consumed him. His hair, once golden like the brief summer sun that graced these lands, had turned to pure white, flowing past his shoulders in waves that seemed to move with a wind that wasn't there. His skin had taken on the translucent quality of ancient ice, pale blue veins visible beneath the surface, like rivers frozen in time. His eyes, however, remained unchanged, a deep blue that held the colour of the deepest ocean, still sharp and aware despite the weight of 300 years of solitude. He wore robes of white fur and silver thread, garments that had not aged because nothing in his kingdom aged anymore, suspended as it was in a moment that refused to end. Iskeran rose from his throne, his movements fluid despite the ages he had sat there. He walked to one of the great windows that lined the throne room, each pane made from ice so clear it might have been glass, had glass been able to withstand the bitter cold that was the natural state of Norvengard. Beyond the window stretched his kingdom, a landscape of haunting beauty and terrible emptiness. The city of Crystal Haven spread below him, its buildings intact, its streets unmarked by the passage of time, but utterly devoid of life. No smoke rose from chimneys, no voices carried on the wind. The marketplace where thousands had once bartered and laughed now stood silent, stalls still arranged as they had been on that day. 3 centuries passed when everything had changed. The Ice King pressed one pale hand against the window, and frost bloomed from his fingertips in intricate patterns that resembled nothing so much as memories given form. He could see them there in the frost. His wife, Alara, her dark hair a stark contrast to the whiteness of their world, her laughter bright enough to warm even the coldest winter day. Their daughter Freya, barely 10 winters old when the curse had fallen, her small hands always cold despite the furs they wrapped her in, her smile capable of melting his heart in ways the endless winter never could. His advisors, his guards, his subjects, all of them preserved in these frost memories, forever young, forever lost. The curse had come without warning, as such things often do. Iskeron had been a just ruler, perhaps too just for the liking of some. He had refused the demands of the witch lords of the eastern wastes, a cabal of sorcerers who had sought to use Norvengard as a staging ground for their conquest of the southern kingdoms. When they came with their armies of ice wraiths and frost giants, Iskeron had stood against them with his own magic, for the rulers of Norvengard had always possessed a connection to the winter, an ability to call upon the cold itself as both weapon and shield. The battle had raged for 7 days and 7 nights, the sky itself torn apart by competing magics. Iskeron had proven stronger than the witch lords anticipated. One by one, he had shattered their armies, breaking the ice wraiths back into the formless cold from which they came, sending the frost giants fleeing back to their mountain caves. On the 7th day, as victory seemed certain, the witch lords had played their final desperate card. They had combined their remaining power into a single curse, not of destruction, but of isolation, not meant to kill, but to remove Norvengard from the world entirely. The curse had struck like a wave of invisible force, washing over the kingdom in an instant. Iskeron had felt it the moment it took hold, a sensation like being encased in amber, like being caught between one heartbeat and the next. Every living thing in Norvengard had been frozen, not in ice, but in time itself. His people had simply stopped, caught mid-step, mid-word, mid-breath. Children remained suspended in the act of throwing snowballs. Merchants held coins that would never complete their journey from hand to hand. His wife and daughter, who had been standing beside him on the palace balcony, became as still as statues carved from flesh. But Iskeron himself had been spared this fate, and that had been the cruelest part of the curse. As the ruler, as the one who wielded the magic of winter, he remained conscious, aware, alive in a way his subjects were not. He could move, could think, could feel, and feeling was the torture of it. The witch lords had ensured he would remain awake to witness his failure, to spend eternity among his frozen people, unable to break the curse, unable to save them, unable even to join them in their timeless sleep. The 1st century had been the hardest. Iskeron had tried everything within his considerable power to break the curse. He had pored over every scroll in the royal library, had attempted counterspells and rituals that drained him to the point of collapse. He had climbed to the highest peak of the Frostspire Mountains and called out to the ancient spirits of winter, begging for their aid. He had descended into the deepest ice caves where the old magic was said to dwell, offering himself as a sacrifice if only his people could be freed. Nothing had worked. The curse was too powerful, too perfectly crafted. It was woven from the combined might of 7 witch lords, and it would require something equally powerful to undo it. The 2nd century had brought resignation. Iskeron had continued his studies, but with less urgency, knowing in his heart that he had exhausted every possibility. He had walked among his frozen subjects, speaking to them as if they could hear, telling them stories of what the world beyond their kingdom must be like now. he had maintained the city as best he could, using his magic to repair structures damaged by the occasional earthquake or storm. He had kept Crystal Haven pristine, a perfect snapshot of a moment 300 years past, because to let it decay would have been to admit defeat, to acknowledge that his people were truly lost. The 3rd century, the one in which he now found himself in its twilight years, had brought something unexpected. Not hope, exactly, but a kind of renewed purpose. Iskaran had begun to notice changes in the world beyond his kingdom. The aurora lights that danced above Norvengard had started to pulse with patterns he had never seen before. The winds that swept across the tundra carried whispers of words and languages that had not existed when his kingdom fell. Most significantly, he had felt tremors in the fabric of the curse itself, tiny fluctuations that suggested something in the wider world was changing, shifting in ways that might finally affect the magic that held Norvengard in its grip. It was this realization that had drawn him from his throne today. For the first time in 300 years, Iskaran felt something he had thought lost forever, the possibility of change. He turned from the window and made his way through the silent palace, his footsteps echoing in halls that had known no other sound for centuries. He passed through corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, rulers of Norvengard stretching back 1,000 years, each one wearing the same crown of ice and silver that now rested on Iskaran's head. He wondered what they would think of him, whether they would see his survival as strength or his inability to break the curse as weakness. The palace library was his destination, a vast circular room with shelves that spiraled up toward a domed ceiling, painted with a map of the stars, as they had appeared on the night of Norvengard's founding. Iskaran had spent countless hours here, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of his people, books on magic and history, scrolls detailing ancient rituals, tablets carved with the words of the first winter mages. All of it had been consumed and studied and memorized until he could recite entire volumes from memory. But today he sought something specific. Deep in the library's heart, protected by wards only he could pass, stood a single pedestal made from black ice quarried from the deepest part of the northern ocean. Upon this pedestal rested a book bound in white leather, its pages made from something that was neither paper nor parchment, but rather seemed to be frozen light given solid form. This was the Codex of Endless Winter, the most sacred text of Norvengard, written by the kingdom's founder, Bormak I, more than a millennium ago. Iskaran had consulted the Codex countless times over the centuries, but always he had focused on the sections dealing with magic, with spells and counter curses. Now, prompted by some instinct he could not name, he opened the book to its final pages, sections he had largely ignored because they dealt not with magic but with prophecy. Bormak had possessed the gift of foresight, and in his final years he had recorded visions of Norvengard's future, cryptic passages that spoke of trials and triumphs yet to come. The Ice King's fingers traced over words written in silver ink that shimmered even in the dim light of the library. Most of the prophecies he had read before and dismissed as either fulfilled or irrelevant, but one passage now caught his attention, a verse he had somehow overlooked in all his previous readings, or perhaps one that had not been visible until this moment. The ink seemed to glow brighter as his gaze fell upon it, and he read aloud, his voice the only sound in the silent library. When 3 centuries have turned and the world beyond remembers not the crown of ice, and the guardian stands alone among his frozen children, and despair has worn the edges of his hope to nothing, then shall come the thaw. Not from within, but from without. Not through power, but through sacrifice. Not by magic, but by the one thing magic cannot touch. A heart unchanged by time. A love that refuses to forget. Iskeron read the passage 3 times, each word settling into his mind like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through his understanding. 3 centuries, the exact time that had passed, the world that had forgotten him. That much was certainly true. But the rest, this talk of thaw and sacrifice and unchanged hearts, what could it mean? He had sacrificed everything already. His kingdom, his family, his own existence beyond these frozen borders. What more could possibly be required? He closed the codex and stood in the silent library, feeling the weight of the prophecy settle over him, like a new burden added to the many he already carried. For 300 years, he had been reactive, trying to break a curse that had already been cast, attempting to undo what had been done. But prophecy suggested a different approach, not breaking the curse, but waiting for conditions to align, for the right moment when the magic might finally be vulnerable. The tremors he had felt in the curse, the changes in the aurora, the whispers on the wind. Perhaps these were signs that the moment was approaching. Perhaps after 3 centuries of isolation, the world was finally ready to remember the Ice King of the North. But how would this remembering come? Who in the world beyond Norvengard even knew his kingdom had existed? The curse had not merely frozen his people in time, it had erased Norvengard from the memory of the world, removed it from maps and histories, caused those who had once known of the Northern Kingdom to forget it had ever been. Iskeron left the library and made his way to the highest tower of the palace, a journey that took him up a spiral staircase of 563 steps. He had counted them many times during his long isolation. At the top was an observatory, a room with walls of pure ice that allowed an unobstructed view of the lands in all directions. Here, he kept instruments that measured the flow of magic in the world, delicate constructs of crystal and silver that had been created by the greatest artificers of old Norvengard. The instruments were all active, their needles and dials moving in ways they had not moved for decades. The ley lines, the invisible rivers of magical energy that flowed through the world, were shifting. Something significant was happening beyond the borders of his frozen kingdom. Something that was affecting the very fabric of magic itself. Iskeron studied the readings, his mind working through possibilities. A great working of magic somewhere in the world? A natural phenomenon that affected the flow of energy? Or perhaps something related to the curse itself? Some external change that was weakening the bonds that held Norvengard outside of time? As he pondered these questions, movement in the distance caught his eye. Iskeron froze, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. There, at the very edge of his kingdom, where the frozen tundra met the slightly less frozen tundra that marked the border of Norvengard's curse, something was moving. For the first time in 300 years, something living had approached his kingdom. The Ice King pressed his face close to the wall, his breath forming patterns of frost on the already frozen surface. The figure was small, human-sized, wrapped in furs that marked them as a traveler from the south. He moved slowly, struggling against the wind and snow that was ever present at Norvengard's borders. As Iskeron watched, the figure stumbled, fell, rose again with evident difficulty. They were alone, which was strange. No one traveled the northern wastes alone, not if they valued their life. Yet here was someone doing exactly that, making their way directly toward the one place in the north that no one should have been able to find, that no one should have even remembered existed. A spark of something Iskaran had not felt in centuries flared in his chest. Excitement, perhaps, or fear, or some combination of both. He left the observatory at a run, descending the stairs 3 at a time, racing through the palace halls with a speed that belied his ancient nature. He had to reach the border, had to see who this impossible traveler was, had to understand why they had come. The prophecy's words echoed in his mind, not from within, but from without. The journey from the palace to the kingdom's border took Iskarin just under an hour, even moving at his fastest pace. He could have used his magic to transport himself instantly, but something made him want to make the journey on foot, to feel the reality of movement after so long sitting still. He passed through Crystal Haven, through streets where his frozen subjects stood eternal guard over shops and homes. He passed through the great gates of the city, massive constructs of iron and ice that had not been opened since the day the curse fell. He passed through the outlying villages, through farmlands where crops stood frozen in their fields, forever on the verge of harvest. Finally, he reached the border, marked by a line of standing stones that the first rulers of Norvengard had erected to define their territory. Beyond these stones, the world was muted, colors less vibrant, sounds less clear. This was the edge of the curse, the boundary between frozen time and the world that continued to turn. Iskarin could cross this boundary if he wished, could walk out into the wider world, but he never had. To leave Norvengard would have been to abandon his people. That was something he could never do. The traveller had collapsed just beyond the standing stones, their body a small, dark shape against the white snow. Iskarin could see their chest rising and falling. They were alive, but barely. Without thinking about the consequences, acting on an instinct that came from being a ruler who had once cared deeply for the welfare of others, Iskaran stepped across the boundary. The moment his foot touched the ground beyond the standing stones, he felt it, a rush of sensation, of time flowing around him instead of standing still. It was disorienting after centuries of timelessness, like stepping from a quiet room into a roaring river. He reached the traveller in moments and knelt beside them, carefully turning them over. The furs fell away from their face, and Iskarin found himself looking at a young woman, perhaps 25 winters old, with dark hair that reminded him painfully of Alara. Her lips were blue with cold, her skin pale from exposure, but her eyes, when they fluttered open, were a warm brown that seemed to hold depths of determination. "The Ice King," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I found you. I remembered." Those words, "I remembered," struck Iskaran with the force of a physical blow. The curse made people forget. That was part of its power, part of what made it unbreakable. Yet here was someone who had remembered, who had somehow retained knowledge of Norvengard and its ruler, who had travelled across the frozen north alone to find a kingdom that should not have existed in anyone's memory. "Who are you?" Iskaran asked, his own voice rough from centuries of speaking only to himself. "How do you know of me?" The woman's eyes closed again, and for a moment Iskarin feared she had slipped into unconsciousness, or worse. But then she spoke, each word an effort. "My name is Astrid. My grandmother. She was from Norvengard. She escaped the day before the curse fell. She carried the memory, passed it down, told me to find you, told me you were waiting." Astrid's words rearranged Iskarin's understanding of everything. Someone had escaped the curse, had carried the memory of Norvengard out into the world, had kept that memory alive through generations until it reached this woman who had undertaken an impossible journey to find him. The prophecy's words came back to him, a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. He gathered Astrid into his arms, marveling at how light she was, how fragile compared to his own timeless existence. He carried her back across the boundary into Norvengard, and as he did, he felt something shift in the air around him. The curse, which had held absolute for 3 centuries, trembled. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Iskaran had spent so long studying the curse that he could feel every nuance of its structure. Bringing Astrid into Norvengard, bringing someone who remembered from the outside world, had created a crack in the magic, tiny but real. He took her to the palace, to his own chambers, where a fire burned that gave off no heat, but also required no fuel, one of the many paradoxes of his frozen kingdom. He laid her on his bed, the first person besides himself to occupy it in 300 years, and used his magic to slowly warm her, careful not to do it too quickly, lest the shock harm her. As colour returned to her face and her breathing steadied, Iskarin sat beside the bed and waited. It took several hours before Astrid fully woke. When she did, her eyes went wide as she took in her surroundings. The room of ice and silver, the magical fire, and most of all, Iskaran himself, the legendary Ice King made real. She sat up slowly, and Iskaran noticed she was stronger than he had expected, recovering with a resilience that spoke of determination and preparation. "I'm really here," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Norvengard. It's exactly as my grandmother described it. The Jewel of the North, she called it. She said it was the most beautiful place in the world." "Your grandmother," Iskaran said gently. "What was her name?" "Senna," Astrid replied. "She was a weaver in Crystalhaven. She had gone to visit her sister in the Southern Territories, and was delayed by a storm. When she returned, she found nothing. At first she thought she had lost her way, that she had somehow ended up in the wrong place, but she knew these lands too well for that. Norvengard had simply vanished." Iskaran remembered Senna, though the memory was distant. She had been young when he had last seen her. Just a girl, really, learning her craft from her mother. That she had escaped the curse by pure chance seemed almost too perfect, as if fate itself had been laying groundwork for this moment 3 centuries in advance. "She tried to tell people," Astrid continued. "She went to the southern kingdoms, to the historians and the map makers, and told them about Norvengard, but no one believed her. They said there was no kingdom in the north, that she must have dreamed it or invented it. The curse had done its work well, but Senna refused to forget. She married, had children, and she told them all about the homeland she had lost. Most of them thought she was mad, or that she was telling stories. But my mother believed her, and she told me, and I believed too." "Why did you come?" Iskaran asked. "What made you attempt such a dangerous journey?" Astrid's expression grew serious. Because my grandmother's final words before she died were about Norvengard. She made me promise that I would find it, that I would find you. She said the curse could only be broken by someone from outside who remembered, and that 3 centuries would pass before the time was right. She said... Astrid paused, as if unsure whether to continue. Say it, Iskerin urged. She said that you had been waiting alone all this time, that you had never stopped trying to save your people, and that you deserved to know someone still remembered, even if nothing could be done. The Ice King felt something crack inside himself, a different kind of breaking than the magical tremor in the curse. This was an emotional rupture. The wall he had built around his heart over centuries of isolation suddenly crumbling. Tears formed in his eyes, the first he had shed in 200 years, and they froze on his cheeks as they fell, tiny diamonds of ice that caught the light and sparkled. I have waited, he said softly, and I have tried everything, but I could never find the key to breaking the curse. Astrid reached out and took his hand, and Iskerin was shocked by the warmth of her touch, by the reminder of what living flesh felt like. Show me your kingdom, she said. Show me the people my grandmother loved, even if we cannot save them. Let me see what she remembered so clearly. And so Iskerin led Astrid through Norvengard, showing her crystal heaven in all its frozen glory, introducing her to his subjects who stood like statues throughout the city. He showed her the marketplace where her grandmother would have worked, the weaver's district with its looms still threaded with half-finished tapestries. He showed her the palace gardens where ice flowers bloomed eternal, never wilting, never growing, caught forever in their peak beauty. He showed her his family, Ilara and Freya, still standing on the balcony where they had been when the curse fell, and Astrid wept for them, tears that marked the first real grieving Iskerin had witnessed for his lost kingdom in all the long centuries. As they walked and talked, Iskerin felt the curse continue to tremble. Each hour Astrid spent in Norvengard, each memory she shared of what her grandmother had told her, each moment she existed as a living link between the frozen kingdom and the world that had forgotten it, weakened the magic that held them. By the time they returned to the palace, Iskerin could feel it clearly. The curse was failing. It's you, he said to Astrid as they stood in the throne room. You are the key. The prophecy spoke of a heart unchanged by time, a love that refuses to forget. Your grandmother loved Norvengard so much that she kept its memory alive for 3 centuries, passing that love down through her family until it reached you. That's what the curse cannot withstand. Not power, not magic, but memory preserved through generations. Love that refuses to die. Astrid looked around the throne room with new understanding. Then what do we do? How do we finish breaking the curse? Iskerin walked to his throne and removed the crown from his head, the crown of ice and silver that had marked him as king for 3 centuries. He held it out to Astrid. The curse was designed to isolate Norvengard, to make the world forget. But you remembered. You came. You brought the outside world back to us. Now, we need to do the same in reverse. We need to bring Norvengard back to the world. He placed the crown in her hands. Take this beyond the border. Return to your home, to your people. Show them this crown. Tell them the story of Norvengard. Make them remember. When enough people in the outside world hold the memory of this kingdom in their hearts, When we exist in the collective consciousness of the world again, the curse will have no power. We will snap back into time, back into the world, as if we had never left. Astrid held the crown, feeling its weight, understanding the magnitude of what he was asking. But that could take years, decades. How will you survive that much longer alone? I have already survived 3 centuries, Iskaran said with a sad smile. I can endure whatever time is necessary. Besides, I won't be truly alone anymore. Now I know someone remembers, someone cares. That changes everything. But Astrid shook her head. There has to be another way. The prophecy spoke of sacrifice. What if... She paused, thinking. What if the sacrifice is mine to make, not yours? You've already sacrificed everything. Maybe it's time someone sacrificed something for you. Before Iskaran could ask what she meant, Astrid closed her eyes and clasped the crown tightly. She began to speak in a language Iskaran didn't recognize at first, but then he realized it was Old Norvengardian, the ancient dialect that predated even Vormak I. His eyes widened as he understood. Senna had taught her family not just memories of Norvengard, but its language, its magic, its very essence. Astrid was working a spell, one that Iskaran quickly recognized as incredibly dangerous. She was offering herself as a bridge, using her life force to connect Norvengard to the outside world, to pull the kingdom back into the flow of time, by anchoring it to her own timeline. It was brilliant and terrible. It would work, but the strain might kill her. "Stop!" Iskaran commanded, rushing forward. "You'll die!" "I'm willing to risk it," Astrid said. Her voice strained as power built around her. My grandmother spent her whole life mourning what she had lost. She passed that grief down to my mother, to me. Let me turn that grief into something good. Let me be the one who brings Norvengard home. The magic swirled around them both now, visible as streams of light that flowed between Astrid and the very walls of the throne room. Iskaran could feel the curse shattering, breaking apart under the assault of this impossible spell, but he could also feel Astrid weakening, her life force being consumed by the working. Without thinking, acting on instinct and 3 centuries of mastered magic, Iskaran joined his power to hers. The Ice King reached out and took Astrid's hands, the crown held between their joined palms. He poured his own magic into the spell, adding his strength to hers, sharing the burden she had tried to take on alone. Together, their combined power surged through Norvengard, touching every frozen citizen, every stopped moment, every suspended second of the last 300 years. The curse broke with a sound like the world's largest mirror shattering. Time rushed back into Norvengard like a flood, and suddenly everything was moving again. In the marketplace, merchants completed sales that had been frozen mid-transaction. In homes throughout Crystal Haven, families finished conversations that had been interrupted 3 centuries ago. On the palace balcony, Alara and Freya gasped as time resumed, finding themselves looking at a city unchanged yet somehow different. And in the throne room, Iskaran and Astrid collapsed together, the spell complete, the curse broken, the cost paid. The Ice King looked up at the ceiling of his throne room and saw, for the first time in 300 years, dust motes floating in the air, tiny particles that moved and drifted, because time was flowing again, because change was possible again, those whose kingdom had returned to the world. Beside him, Astrid breathed heavily but smiled. "We did it," she whispered. "Your people are free." Iskeran took her hand and helped her to her feet. Outside, he could hear sounds he had not heard in centuries. Voices raised in confusion and wonder. Footsteps as people moved through the streets. The living sounds of the kingdom restored. He looked at Astrid, this impossible woman who had traveled across the world to remember what everyone else had forgotten, and he knew that whatever came next, Norvingard would face it, not alone, but as part of the world again, connected, remembered, and finally free. The forgotten Ice King of the North was forgotten no more. The lost King of Scotland. The wind howled across the highlands like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the scent of heather and the whispers of forgotten battles. In the year 1746, the world knew of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the doomed Jacobite rising, but few remembered the name that had been deliberately erased from Scottish history. King Malcolm IV, known to those who still spoke of him in hushed tones as Malcolm the Forgotten. His story began not in the grand halls of Edinburgh or Stirling, but in a crumbling monastery perched on the edge of Loch Ness, where the water churned dark and mysterious beneath granite cliffs. It was there, in the summer of 1153, that a young monk named Brother Aldwin discovered a cache of documents hidden beneath the flagstones of the chapel floor. The parchments were ancient even then, their edges brittle with age, their words written in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic that required weeks of careful translation. What Brother Aldwin uncovered would change everything he thought he knew about Scottish history. The documents spoke of a king who had ruled for barely 3 years in the mid-11th century, a monarch whose reign had been so thoroughly obliterated from the records that even the chroniclers of later generations had no knowledge of his existence. This was Malcolm, son of Duncan the First, elder brother to the man history would remember as Malcolm III, called Canmore, the great chief. The true Malcolm, the elder son, had been chosen as king in the year 1057, following the death of Macbeth at the Battle of Lumphanan. He was 23 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair the colour of autumn wheat and eyes that held the depth of the northern seas. Unlike his younger brother, who had spent years in exile at the English court, Malcolm had been raised among the Highland clans, learning their ways, speaking their tongue, understanding the ancient customs that bound the people to the land. His coronation took place on the hill of Scone, where Scottish kings had been crowned since time immemorial. The stone of destiny sat beneath him as the assembled nobles placed the crown upon his head, and for a moment it seemed that Scotland had found a king who could unite the fractured kingdom, heal the wounds left by decades of warfare, and restore the old ways that were slowly being forgotten. But Malcolm IV's vision for Scotland differed dramatically from what the powerful southern lords desired. While they looked to England and the growing Norman influence, Malcolm turned his gaze to the ancient Celtic traditions, to the laws of tanistry and the communal ownership of land that had governed his people for generations. He refused to grant vast estates to Norman knights, rejected the feudal system that was transforming England, and insisted that Scottish law and custom should remain supreme in Scottish lands. Within months of his coronation, the conspiracies began. The southern lords, many of whom had married into Norman families or held lands on both sides of the border, saw Malcolm's policies as dangerously backward a rejection of the progress and civilization that the Norman influence promised. They whispered in dark corners about the young king's stubbornness, his preference for Highland counsel over their own wisdom, his determination to preserve a way of life they believed was destined for extinction. The leader of this faction was Thorfinn Sigurdsson, Earl of Orkney, a man of mixed Norse and Scottish blood who controlled vast territories in the north. Thorfinn had supported Macbeth's claim to the throne and had only grudgingly accepted the return of Duncan's line. He saw in young Malcolm not a king, but an obstacle to his own ambitions. Joining him were several powerful southern lords, Gospatric, who held lands in Northumbria, Siward's sons, who remembered their father's campaigns in Scotland, and most significantly, Malcolm's own younger brother, the prince who history would later crown as Malcolm III. The younger Malcolm, barely 18 years old, but already hardened by his years in England, had absorbed the Norman worldview completely. He had seen the great stone castles rising across England, witnessed the efficiency of Norman administration, and understood the power that came from adopting these new methods. Where his brothers saw the preservation of Scottish identity, the younger Malcolm saw opportunity and advancement. The conspiracy took shape over many months, conducted in whispered conversations and sealed letters carried by trusted messengers. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would not merely depose King Malcolm IV, they would erase him entirely. His reign would be stricken from the records, his name removed from the list of Scottish kings, his very existence denied by future generations. It would be as if he had never ruled at all, as if the crown had passed directly from Duncan I to Malcolm III, with nothing but Macbeth's usurpation in between. In the early spring of 1060, the trap was sprung. King Malcolm was invited to a gathering of the northern lords at Inverness, ostensibly to discuss matters of defence against Norse raiders. He travelled with a small retinue of loyal men, never suspecting that he rode toward betrayal. On the third night of his stay, as he slept in a chamber of Inverness Castle, armed men burst through the door. The fight was brief but fierce. Malcolm's personal guard died defending him, their blood staining the stone floor. The king himself killed 2 attackers before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But they did not kill him. That was crucial to the plan. A dead king could become a martyr, a rallying point for rebellion. Instead, they needed him to disappear, to vanish so completely that doubt would cloud any future claims of his existence. Bound in chains and gagged to silence his protests, Malcolm was smuggled out of Inverness Castle before dawn. A body, some nameless man of similar build, was dressed in the king's nightclothes and left dead in his chamber, his face so mutilated by sword strokes that identification would be impossible. The official story spread quickly. The king had been murdered by unknown assassins, likely Norse raiders or supporters of Macbeth's line seeking revenge. The younger Malcolm, displaying appropriate grief and righteous anger, was crowned within a fortnight. His first acts as king were telling. He granted extensive lands to Norman knights, established feudal obligations throughout the southern lowlands, and began the transformation of Scotland into a kingdom that resembled its southern neighbour. The old Celtic laws were gradually suppressed, replaced by Norman legal codes. The ancient system of tanistry, where kings were chosen by merit rather than strict primogeniture, was abandoned in favour of direct inheritance. And what of the true Malcolm, the forgotten king? He was taken in darkness to a remote monastery on the Isle of Skye, a place so isolated that few even knew of its existence. There, in a stone cell overlooking the churning waters of the Minch, he would spend the remainder of his days, forbidden from speaking his true name, watched constantly by guards who ensured he could never escape or make contact with the outside world. The monks who tended him were sworn to secrecy under pain of excommunication and death. They knew him only as Brother Columba, a nobleman who had taken holy orders after some unnamed transgression. Malcolm IV, rightful King of Scotland, disappeared into the mists of obscurity, while his brother wore the crown and shaped the kingdom according to his Norman-influenced vision. Yet the conspirators had underestimated the loyalty of some of Malcolm's followers. A handful of Highland chiefs who had supported the true king suspected foul play. They could not believe that assassins had struck so precisely, killing Malcolm while leaving his brother conveniently alive and ready to assume power. These men began their own quiet investigation, sending trusted agents to gather information, piece together rumors, follow the faint trails that the conspirators had tried so hard to erase. It took 3 years, but eventually they found him. A fisherman from the Isle of Skye, travelling to the mainland to sell his catch, mentioned to a contact in Fort William that the monastery on the western coast of the island housed a mysterious prisoner, a man who bore himself like nobility despite his monk's robes, who sometimes wept while staring across the water toward the mainland, who had eyes the colour of the northern seas. The loyal chiefs convened in secret, meeting in a hidden glen where their ancestors had gathered before battles in ages past. They debated long into the night about what should be done. Some argued for immediate action, gather their forces, rescue their true king, march on Edinburgh and expose the usurper. Others counselled caution, pointing out that Malcolm III was now firmly established on the throne, supported by powerful Norman allies, commanding armies that far outnumbered anything the Highland chiefs could muster. In the end, wisdom prevailed over passion. They decided to send a single man to the monastery, someone who could verify the prisoner's identity, and, if he was indeed their lost king, offer him hope that he had not been entirely forgotten. The man chosen for this dangerous mission was Cormac MacLeod, a warrior in his 40th year who had served in Malcolm IV's personal guard and had miraculously survived the massacre at Inverness by being absent that night on another errand. Cormac travelled to Skye in the guise of a pilgrim seeking spiritual guidance. The monastery accepted him without suspicion. They received few visitors, but turned none away who came in genuine faith. For 2 weeks, Cormac lived among the monks, participating in their prayers and labours, carefully observing everyone he encountered, searching for the man he had once sworn to protect with his life. He found him in the monastery garden, tending to herbs with hands that had once wielded a sword with deadly skill. The years had aged Malcolm. He was now 26, but looked older, his hair touched with premature grey, his face lined with sorrow and resignation. Yet Cormac knew him instantly, would have known him anywhere. Those distinctive eyes that could belong to no other. Their meeting had to be carefully orchestrated. Cormac waited until the afternoon prayers, when most of the monks gathered in the chapel, leaving only a few brothers working in the gardens and outbuildings. He approached Malcolm while the deposed king knelt among the rosemary and thyme, his hands dark with soil, his monk's robe dusty from his labours. Brother Columba, Cormac said quietly, using the name the monks knew. Might I seek your counsel on a spiritual matter? Malcolm looked up, and for a heartbeat, recognition flashed across his features. But years of captivity had taught him caution. He rose slowly, brushing dirt from his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Of course, my son, walk with me, and we shall talk. They moved deeper into the garden, away from the monastery buildings, toward a low stone wall that overlooked the sea. Only when they were certain no one could overhear did Cormac speak again, this time in the Gaelic tongue, rather than the Latin the monks preferred. My lord, he said simply, your people have not forgotten you. Malcolm closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they glistened with tears he refused to let fall. Cormac, he whispered, you survived Inverness. Thank God. I had feared all my loyal men perished that night. Most did, sire, but a handful of us escaped, and we have been searching for you these 3 years past. The Highland chiefs know of your imprisonment. They would raise armies to free you if you but give the word. For a long moment, Malcolm said nothing, staring out across the water toward the mainland, toward the kingdom that should have been his. The wind pulled at his robes, carrying the salt scent of the sea and the distant cries of seabirds. No, he said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. Too much blood has already been spilled in Scotland's name. If the chiefs rise up now, my brother will crush them utterly. The Norman armies will devastate the Highlands. The people will suffer for my sake, and I cannot bear that burden. But you are the rightful king, Cormac protested. Malcolm III sits on a throne built on treachery and lies. History must know the truth. History, Malcolm said bitterly, is written by those who hold power, not by those who hold the right. My brother has already succeeded in erasing me from the chronicles. To future generations, I will be nothing more than a footnote, if I am remembered at all. Perhaps that is for the best. How can you say such a thing? You fought for Scotland, for the old ways, for everything our people hold sacred. Malcolm turned from the sea to face his former guard, and Cormac was struck by the change in him. This was no longer the fierce young king who had defied the Norman lords, but a man who had been broken by years of isolation and helplessness, worn down by the knowledge that his sacrifice had changed nothing. The old ways are dying, Cormac. Perhaps they were always doomed. My brother understands what I was too proud to see. Scotland cannot stand alone against the tide of change sweeping across these islands. The Norman influence will transform us, whether we wish it or not. By resisting, I might have doomed our people to perpetual warfare and poverty. At least my brother's path offers stability, even if it means surrendering much of what made us uniquely Scottish. Then you will remain here, accept this imprisonment without protest? What choice do I have? If I escape, if I reveal myself, I doom countless others to death in a war they cannot win. Better that I remain Brother Columba, a forgotten man in a forgotten place, and let Scotland move forward without me. Cormac felt his heart break for his king, seeing the defeat in his eyes, the weight of abandonment and loss that bowed his shoulders. The chiefs asked me to tell you something, sire. They said that even if you cannot be restored to your throne, even if the world never knows your name, they will preserve your memory. They will pass down the truth from father to son, from generation to generation, so that somewhere in some hidden corners of the Highlands, people will always know that once there was a king who fought for them, who chose exile over compromise, who sacrificed everything rather than betray the old ways. For the first time since their conversation began, Malcolm smiled, a sad, weary smile, but genuine nonetheless. That is worth more than any crown, old friend. Tell them I accept their gift gratefully. Tell them to care for our people, to preserve what they can of our traditions, to remember that being Scottish means more than simply occupying this land. It means carrying forward the values and customs that our ancestors died to protect. They spoke for another hour, sharing news and memories. Two men bound by loyalty and loss, standing at the edge of the world while history moved on without them. When Cormac finally departed the monastery, he carried with him not the vengeful declaration of a deposed king demanding restoration, but rather a message of acceptance and hope, that even in defeat, even in obscurity, Malcolm had found a kind of peace. The Highland chiefs received Cormac's report with mixed emotions. Some raged against Malcolm's decision, arguing that he had no right to deny his people the chance to fight for him. Others understood his wisdom, recognizing that pragmatism sometimes required painful sacrifices. In the end, they honored his wishes. There would be no rebellion, no attempt to rescue him from his island prison, no public revelation of his survival. Instead, they began the long work of preservation. In hidden glens and remote valleys, in whispered stories told by firelight, the true history of Malcolm IV lived on. Bards composed ballads about the lost king, though they were careful never to sing them where spies for Malcolm III might hear. Scribes copied the few documents that proved his existence, hiding them in secret locations where future generations might one day discover them. Brother Aldwin's discovery in 1153 was one fruit of this careful preservation. The documents he found had been hidden there by one of Malcolm's loyal followers, tucked away in the hope that someday someone would find them and learn the truth. The monk spent the last years of his life carefully translating and copying these precious parchments, creating multiple versions that he distributed to trusted contacts throughout Scotland. But the effort to preserve Malcolm's memory faced constant opposition. Malcolm III and his successors worked tirelessly to erase any trace of the forgotten king. Monasteries were searched, suspicious documents were burned. Anyone caught speaking of a Malcolm who had ruled before Malcolm Canmore faced severe punishment. The official history was clear. Duncan I had been succeeded by the usurper Macbeth, who was eventually defeated by Malcolm III. There was no room in this narrative for another Malcolm, no space for a king who had inconveniently embodied values that the new Scotland was leaving behind. On the Isle of Skye, Brother Columba continued his quiet existence. The years passed slowly, marked by the changing seasons and the eternal rhythm of monastic life. He rose before dawn for prayers, worked in the gardens, studied scripture, and maintained his silence about his true identity. The monks who guarded him grew old and were replaced by younger men who knew nothing of the monastery's secret prisoner, who simply saw another brother devoted to a life of prayer and contemplation. Malcolm aged along with his jailers and fellow monks. The grey in his hair spread until it was entirely silver. His hands, once so strong and skilled with weapons, became gnarled with arthritis from years of manual labour. His eyes, those distinctive northern sea eyes that had once burned with passion for his kingdom, grew dim with cataracts. became an old man, long before his years should have made him so, worn down by isolation and the weight of dreams abandoned. He died in the winter of 1093, 33 years after his deposition, having outlived his usurping brother by 2 years. He was 56 years old, but looked 20 years older. The monks buried him in their cemetery with all the proper rites, marking his grave with a simple stone that bore the name Brother Columba and the dates of his entry into the monastery and his death. No mention was made of his royal blood, his rightful claim to the throne, or the kingdom he had lost. The abbot who presided over the funeral was one of the few remaining monks who knew the truth about Brother Columba's identity. As he scattered holy water over the grave, he whispered a prayer that the official liturgy did not include. "Rest now, Malcolm IV, King of Scotland. You fought for your people and lost, but you are not forgotten. Your sacrifice was not in vain, and your memory will endure long after the stones of castles have crumbled to dust." The centuries rolled forward, and Scotland transformed beyond anything Malcolm would have recognized. The Norman influence his brother had welcomed reshaped the kingdom completely. Great stone castles rose across the land, replacing the old hill forts. The feudal system took root, creating a rigid hierarchy of nobles and vassals. The Celtic laws and customs that Malcolm had fought to preserve were gradually suppressed, surviving only in the most remote corners of the Highlands. Yet the memory of the lost king persisted in those hidden corners. In the 18th century, when Bonnie Prince Charlie raised his standard and called the clans to fight for the Stuart cause, old men told their grandsons about another prince, another king, who had been betrayed and forgotten. The parallel was not lost on them. Both men had represented a vision of Scotland that modernity seemed determined to destroy. Both had been defeated not by superior force alone, but by the inevitable march of historical change. After the final defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden in 1746, when the British government set about systematically destroying Highland culture, burning clan tartans, banning bagpipes, and forcing the people to abandon their traditional ways of life, a few elderly Highlanders made secret pilgrimages to the Isle of Skye. They sought out the old monastery, which had long since fallen into ruins, and searched among the tumbled stones and overgrown graves for any trace of the king their ancestors had served. Most found nothing. The centuries had erased names from weathered headstones, and the monks who had known the truth were 600 years dead. But one searcher, a man named Angus MacLeod, who claimed descent from Cormac himself, discovered something remarkable. Beneath a collapsed section of the monastery wall, protected by the fallen stones, was a small stone box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the centuries, were 3 parchment pages covered in faded but still legible writing. The documents were in a mixture of Latin and Gaelic, written in different hands, apparently compiled by several authors. They told the story of Malcolm IV, his brief reign, his betrayal, his imprisonment, and his death. They named the conspirators, described the plot in detail, and preserved testimony from witnesses who had seen the deposed king alive, years after he was supposed to have died. Most remarkably, they included a physical description of Malcolm that matched perfectly the few contemporary accounts that had survived, leaving little doubt about the document's authenticity. Angus MacLeod understood immediately what he had found. These pages were proof, fragile, ancient, but undeniable proof that the lost king had existed. that he had been deliberately erased from history, that the official chronicles of Scotland had been falsified to hide an inconvenient truth. He carefully rewrapped the documents and carried them home, where he made meticulous copies before hiding the originals in a new location, learning from history's lesson that precious things should never exist in only one place. He shared the discovery with a small circle of trusted friends, men who still valued the old Highland ways despite the laws forbidding such sentiments. They discussed what should be done with this evidence. Should they publish it, expose the historical lie, demand that Malcolm IV be restored to his rightful place in the Chronicle of Scottish Kings? Or would such a revelation simply invite the authorities to confiscate and destroy these precious documents, silencing the lost king's voice forever? In the end, caution prevailed once again. Scotland in the mid-18th century was a dangerous place for those who clung to old traditions and challenged official narratives. The documents were copied several more times, with the copies distributed to various hiding places throughout the Highlands. The originals were sealed in a metal box and buried in a secret location known only to Angus MacLeod and his eldest son. The story might have ended there, with Malcolm IV remaining a whispered legend, a ghost story told by Highland fireplaces, believed by some but dismissed by most as romantic folklore. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried, and the Lost King was not quite ready to be forgotten. In the late 19th century, during the Victorian period's romantic fascination with Celtic history, a scholar named Dr. James Sinclair began researching anomalies in the Scottish chronicles. He noticed small inconsistencies in the dating of events during Malcolm III's early reign, gaps in the narrative that didn't quite make sense, references in Irish and Welsh documents to Scottish events that the official Scottish histories never mentioned. Being a meticulous researcher, he began compiling these discrepancies, trying to understand what they might indicate. His investigation led him to the Highlands, where he collected oral histories from elderly residents of remote communities. Time and again, he encountered variations of the same story: a king before Malcolm Canmore, a betrayal, an imprisonment, a deliberate erasure. The details varied, and Dr. Sinclair knew that oral tradition could be unreliable, prone to embellishment and confusion. But the consistency of the core narrative, appearing in communities that had little contact with one another, suggested that these stories might have a common root in actual historical events. Dr. Sinclair's research culminated in a scholarly paper published in 1887, titled The Lost King Hypothesis: Evidence for an Erased Reign in 11th Century Scotland. The paper was cautious in its claims, presenting the evidence without making definitive statements, acknowledging the difficulties of proving events that powerful forces had worked hard to obscure. Nevertheless, it created a minor sensation in academic circles, inspiring other scholars to investigate the mystery of Malcolm IV. The truth, when it finally emerged into the light of accepted history, came not from academic research, but from an accident of fate. In 1942, during the Second World War, German bombers targeting industrial sites in Scotland dropped their payload on what they believed to be a factory, but was actually an ancient manor house being used as military storage. The explosion destroyed the building, but also cracked open a sealed chamber in its foundation, a room that had been locked and forgotten for centuries. Among the debris, soldiers found a collection of documents that had survived by pure chance, protected by the manor's thick stone walls, even as the building above them collapsed. These papers, when examined by historians, proved to be a cache of correspondence between Malcolm III and his fellow conspirators, dating from the years 1058 through 1062. The letters discussed the plot against the elder Malcolm in shocking detail, including explicit acknowledgement that they planned not just to depose him, but to erase him from history entirely. The discovery made headlines throughout Britain. Here was proof, written in the conspirators' own hands, that a king named Malcolm had indeed ruled Scotland before Malcolm III, and that his reign had been deliberately suppressed. Academic historians rushed to re-examine the chronicles, looking for other evidence that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to reconstruct the true story of Malcolm IV, corroborating the oral traditions that Highland communities had preserved for nearly 900 years. Today, Malcolm IV is recognised by historians as a legitimate king of Scotland, though many details of his reign remain obscure. His name has been added to the official list of Scottish monarchs, and scholars continue to uncover new evidence about his brief time on the throne. Yet for all the academic recognition, he remains the lost king, a figure more legendary than historical, a symbol of the paths not taken and the dreams that died before they could be fulfilled. In the Highlands, where his memory was kept alive through centuries of suppression, the vindication of Malcolm's existence brought a measure of satisfaction to the descendants of those who had never forgotten him. The old stories were true after all. There had been a king who fought for the old ways, who chose exile over compromise, who was betrayed and erased, but whose memory survived through sheer, stubborn loyalty. The monastery on Skye, where Malcolm spent his final years, is now a protected historical site. Archaeologists have excavated the ruins, finding among the remains a grave that might be his, though definitive identification is impossible after so many centuries. A simple monument stands there now, bearing an inscription that attempts to summarize a complex life in a few brief words. Here lies Malcolm IV, King of Scotland, who ruled from 1057 to 1060. He fought for his people and lost, but he was not forgotten. The Lost King's story resonates across the centuries because it speaks to fundamental human experiences. The pain of betrayal, the weight of impossible choices, the courage required to accept defeat with dignity. Malcolm IV could have condemned his people to endless warfare in defense of his crown. Instead, he chose obscurity and isolation, allowing history to move forward without him, preserving peace at the cost of his own legacy. In that choice, perhaps, lies his true greatness, not in the battles he might have won or the reforms he might have implemented, but in his willingness to surrender everything when he understood that fighting would bring only suffering to those he had sworn to protect. The forgotten king became, in the end, the sacrificial king, offering himself so that others might live. His name may have been erased from the chronicles for centuries, his reign reduced to a footnote in academic texts, but the lost King of Scotland achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of suppression could destroy. He lives on in the stories still told by Highland firesides, in the scholarly debates about Scotland's medieval history, in the hearts of all who understand that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting to the end, but in knowing when to let go. And somewhere, in hidden places throughout Scotland, the documents that Angus MacLeod copied so carefully still exist, waiting to be discovered by future generations. The lost king's voice continues to echo through the centuries, a reminder that history is never quite as simple as it seems, that truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts to bury it, and that the forgotten are often the ones most worth remembering.